Well, the doors are beginning to close, and so you know what that means. It's soon time for us to get started, and good morning, everybody. My name is Rick Hamilton. For those of you I haven't met, I am Chief Technology Officer at the Foundation. It's wonderful to be here. A little bit of housekeeping. One, this session is being recorded, so just mind that. And secondly, if you've not already done so, please mute your phone. You don't want to be that guy that has your phone go off here, right? So just take a second, make sure your phone is on mute. A little more housekeeping at the end of this discussion. Remote attendees can submit questions through the Q&A on the virtual platform. And for those of you here in the room in person, you can either come to the microphone or you can submit questions via the conference mobile app. So I want to start today up at the 40,000 foot level, okay? And then we're going to bring it down to about the 10,000 foot level on machine learning and focused ultrasound. We're going to talk about what we know and what we don't know. And I think what we don't know is actually the fun stuff that we need to dig into today. So starting at the 40,000 foot level, let's talk about machine learning and healthcare. We hear about these big dramatic breakthroughs, right? Over the last few years, researchers at MIT announced they had the first ever antibiotic designed by artificial intelligence. Certainly, we're all aware of the profound discoveries that have been made by DeepMind's AlphaFold solving effectively the protein folding problem. But not all breakthroughs have to be this impactful or this headline grabbing. There are a tremendous number of small improvements being made every day. I read just this summer in the Lancet that radiologists using AIs are better able to diagnose breast cancer than either the human physician or the learner on its own. So again, this hybrid approach that we've seen work so well in other areas. Also, we've seen research in radiation therapy show us that ML is improving accuracy and efficiency and overall treatment quality. So all of these things are happening. What don't we know? We don't know how and why and where machine learning is going to have the greatest impact to focused ultrasound, but we're going to begin that conversation in earnest today. So let's talk about how we're going to move forward. And I'll start with a contrarian example, how we're not going to move forward. We're not going to move forward with platitudes, right? It's easy to stick your head in the clouds and kind of wave your hands about ML, but if we never ask ourselves the hard questions, then we're not going to make any progress. So the hard questions will start in about 5 minutes. We also don't want to dive down in the weeds. If you leave this session thinking that you've got to become a TensorFlow expert or a PyTorch expert, then I've not done my job today, okay? We need to find that middle ground. The other thing that we need to be aware of is that we're not going to do ML for the sake of doing ML. A true story. A good friend of mine was CTO at a fintech, a financial technology company, and one day his boss, the CEO, came to him and said, "We need a blockchain app." And my friend said, "Why?" And his boss said, "Well, it's cutting edge technology. We need to have a blockchain app." And that was obviously not the right way to go about this. My friend found a new job in about 6 months. We're not going to do ML for the sake of doing ML. We're going to do it where we believe there is a valid reason to do so. So what is that right approach? I believe that the first thing we need to begin doing is to identify the high-value use cases. And high value could mean applicable to many different people, many different scenarios. Or it could mean narrow applicability, but with incredible impact. So we need to begin asking questions. We need to begin asking what if and how. Those of you that know me may be aware, I spent 24 years at IBM. I'm an inventor on over 1,000 issued US patents. And I've made a lifetime of asking how and what if. And I want us as a community to not be afraid of asking these questions as well. A second thing we need to do in this room is we need to understand at a high level, just very general approaches to machine learning. What are the tools and how might we go about applying these tools? We also need to understand the challenges surrounding machine learning so that our time is spent wisely. We need to learn from other healthcare machine learning successes and failures. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. And finally, we need to prepare ourselves personally and professionally for this future where ML pervades all corners of science and technology. And so accordingly, this is the structure we provided for today's talk. We're not always today going to reach clear, concise answers, But I want to do two things, right? One, I want to try to inspire and inform, and I also want to have some fun. We're going to keep this casual. We're going to keep this conversational. And so with that, I want to meet the FUS experts who are beginning to explore machine learning, and also the ML experts who are bringing an outside perspective to this. So I'm going to ask the panelists to basically say 1 to 2 minutes about themselves each, and then we'll dive into the topics. So we're going to start in Shanghai with Bing. Bing, the floor is yours. Spend a minute or two introducing yourself.
Sure. Hi, everyone. First of all, thanks for the invitation. It's really happy for me to be here joining this panel discussion. My name is Bingbing Chen. I'm currently assistant professor at Shanghai Tech University. My background is biomedical engineering, and my story with ultrasound actually traces back to around 10 years ago when I just started my PhD in the States. So at that time, I and my supervisor were trying to use the pinpoint feature of the focused ultrasound to improve the spatial resolution of fluorescence imaging in deep tissue. And that led me into this great focused ultrasound world. And after that, together with my colleagues at UT Southwestern and University of Calgary, I mainly focused on blood-brain opening and microbubble-enhanced transcranial brain hyperthermia for brain disease treatment. So last year, I started my own lab here at Shanghai Tech, and with a focus on exploring focused ultrasound techniques for brain applications. So from our previous work and also others' work, I realized that there are some interesting questions buried in the data that were collected during this occasion. For example, the acoustic captations, harmonics, neural responses, EEG data, etc., you name it. So the question is, how can we make the best use of it? I think the answer might be artificial intelligence or machine learning. So for the things that we cannot see with our naked eye, the machine can help us learn. And for those information that we cannot extract directly, the machine might be able to figure it out. So I named my lab at Shanghai Tech the TRUTH Lab, so which stands for Translational Research in Ultrasound Diagnostics. I believe with more and more available data and sophisticated machine learning models, we will be able to reveal more truths in this field. Thank you.
Thank you, Bing. So with that, I'm going to go to somebody who's really an outsider to the FUS community, but who brings some interesting perspectives. Matt, I presume you're in the UK today. Tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
Thanks, Rick. Yeah, hello, everyone. My name's Matt Howard. I'm the head of healthcare data science for Amazon Web Services, and I'm also part of our international healthcare leadership team. For those who don't know, Amazon Web Services is the cloud business side of Amazon. So we are a separate business, but we are part of the Amazon umbrella. And I'm sure you would have used us without even knowing it in various different ways. We do a lot of work in healthcare. A lot of healthcare systems use us for scale infrastructure. In my role, I sort of hit two things really relevant to this conversation. I run a healthcare data science team who work on early stage, quite cutting edge machine learning techniques, and also work with other colleagues across Amazon Web Services in the same sort of space. So although I'm not a focused ultrasound expert, certainly my team work on a lot of use cases that I suspect will be relevant. And I'm also part of an international healthcare team that work at a countrywide and regional and even hospital level to transform healthcare infrastructure. So a lot of my work is also in the data space and in the modernization of data and how we use cloud technologies in healthcare. And obviously how you actually use cloud for machine learning is one such area, but in more general, the sort of transformation and improvement in health IT is a big part of what we do. So very excited to be here today. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Matt. Tianji, thank you for joining us when you are not feeling well today. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, Rick. Hello, everyone. Nice to meet you guys online. Unfortunately, I could not really attend the conference in person today, but it is great honor to be here. My name is Tianxi Li. I'm currently an assistant professor at University of Virginia. I'm a statistics professor here. So my training was mainly in statistics and machine learning. I got my PhD from University of Michigan. For a short period of time, I also worked as a full-time applied researcher in Microsoft. My main research is mainly about modeling and machine learning in complex systems to understand the interaction mechanism or the connection mechanism in complex system, which can be generally represented by some complicated networks. So this includes social networks, traffic systems, ecological systems, and also include something like brain networks, just brain functional data. So related to the specific field of medical related problems, I work on, say, how to effectively model and some parcellation problem in brain networks where you try to measure the brain activity for different regions from fMRI, and just by using this type of patterns to figure out a certain functioning pattern in brain. I also work a lot of making inference of gene co-expression networks. We try to find, for example, the different modules of genes that just work together as co-expression network for different disease mechanisms. And related to the focused ultrasound projects, I collaborate with a team in the foundation. So we work on, analyzing random, the clinical trials data about ultrasound treatment. We also work on some image analysis, image segmenting analysis from some ultrasound images. So generally speaking, my work is focused on machine learning where you don't have a large sample size, but the problem structure can be pretty complicated. Okay, so it's very nice to share my views here.
Great, thank you very much. Charles, how about yourself?
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for having me on this panel. I am not a machine learning specialist. I studied medicine a long time ago, never did any clinical work, so I'm not a machine learning specialist. I'm not a clinician. I have tried to bridge the medical community with the engineering community in my career. I have mostly worked on applying image analysis techniques to neurological diseases such as multiple sclerosis or Alzheimer's, cerebrovascular disease, and in those fields we mostly try to quantify the disease, lesion volumes, look at patterns of disease, understand the relationships between structure and clinical outcome, structure and function. And this, although I have been at Brigham and Women's Hospital for over 30 years, and Frank Yoles was actually, I was his postdoc, and I saw how Frank Yoles and Kullervo Hininen gave birth to applications in neuro, in applications of focused ultrasound to transcranial applications. I wasn't involved until, unfortunately, after Frank died, and in the last 2 years, I started working with Reese Cosgrove and Nathan McDonald. And the premise was that there was a lot of data, a lot of images lying around that were not leveraged. They have a very big data set. They do about two patients a week treating essential tremor. And I thought, well, maybe we can extract more information, and slowly, with my team, we are becoming more familiar with the actual problems that are of interest to the community. Besides this, I have concerned myself over the past 20 years with developing informatics system, imaging informatics system. Particularly, we have been working on what I call a virtual laboratory, which is essentially a collaborative web-based platform that allows not just data sharing, but also application and sharing of image analysis tools, as well as as well as of statistical and other mathematical models, which means essentially the analogy is that if you think about a laboratory, it's a physical laboratory is a space where you have perhaps some shelves and you have reagents and tools. In our world, the reagents are data and tools are algorithms. That's the analogy. And it's also a meeting place where people with different specializations, computer scientists, medical specialists, research assistants converge to answer questions. And I am thinking that infrastructure also could be of some interest to this community. And I think I'll stop right there.
Great, thank you, Charles. Allison?
Thank you, and thank you for the Focused Ultrasound Foundation for this invitation to be here today. So I'm, like Charles, I'm not a machine learning expert. I've been investigating it actually only about the past 2.5 years. The majority of my efforts have been spent into investigating MR-guided focused ultrasound for use in breast cancer. And through our research throughout the years, as we've taken kind of a high-level view of the tools that are out there to monitor your therapy and assess your therapy. If you look at the literature, there's so many different disparate options of the data you can use, and a lot of times they disagree in the directions they go with how your treatment outcome is. And so we thought, it's our opinion that the development of new, specifically imaging biomarkers is necessary for breast cancer, where it was alluded to in the last session. You can get pretty different results in how you're applying focused ultrasound. And this is particularly timely, I think, because the world of MRI and ultrasound monitoring, the amount of data we can get, the amount of quantitative data we can get is really expanding. You can do it on a more efficient level. And so machine learning to me is a great way that you can leverage that amount of data, whether you're interested in improving your treatment prediction or your treatment monitoring. And so to that end, my labs put a lot of effort into mainly data processing and pre-processing, registering our multiple time steps we have, trying to correlate really rigorously to the histology, to IHC and other kind of spatial data so that we can really ask interesting questions and find new ways to process that data. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Allison. So let's dive in, and I want to make this conversational. The major themes were printed in the program, but we want to start with this big question about use cases and technical approaches that hold promise. And so I think the hard part of, quote, doing ML is asking the right questions and getting the right data. And for me, questions begin with use cases. So that said, I'd love to have some hypotheses about different ways where you believe that ML can make an impact. Let's just start right away with the use cases you want to explore. So Charles, Bing, and Allison, I know each of you had talked a little bit about this in preparation.
Sure, yeah, I'll start it off. If I think there's some, just in the talks online, there was some interesting work where there's all this, the clinical data that's been collected, and Charles alluded to this, the amount of ET data, the amount of uterine fibroid data, or prostate, or, that we have these, I think, large data sets at our disposal that if they were curated correctly, we could ask some really interesting questions about responders and non-responders, what imaging metrics correlated with others. I think there's some really interesting, work that was shown on BBB assessment and using the acoustic data, whether or not that can be interesting. So I think those are just a few, and I'll let other panelists comment.
Bing, Charles?
All right, so yeah, I totally agree with Dr. Peng. And from my point of view, I think fast BB opening definitely should be one of the use cases that we could consider for machine learning. As Dr. Neil Lipsman and Dr. Sonnabend in the brain tumor panel mentioned yesterday, actually, how to quickly and accurately assess the BB opening degree, or whether just get to know whether it is open or not, still remains the problem. The current standard method is to do the contrast enhanced MRI. While the gadolinium enhancement can review the BB opening very nicely, but that requires the injection of the gadolinium, a moderate scanning time, and of course, the access of the MR scanner. And because of those limitations, I think both Dr. Lipsman and Dr. Chen from Changguang Memorial Hospital yesterday, they said for those clinicians, they don't do this type of imaging for every patient or after each treatment. So they just believe with the parameters that they used, the BV should be open. But I think there are still risks there. The BV is not open, or the BV opening degree is different due to the natural variability across different patients. So I think machine learning can play a role here, given that we have all those acoustic emission data from those stimulated microbubbles during sonication. And that data actually reflects the bubble behaviors. As we know, the fast BV opening actually is largely dependent on those bubble behaviors. So I think there is the opportunity over there. If we can combine machine learning and those reflected acoustic emission data from those bubbles, then we may be able to find a way to quickly and accurately predict or review the BB opening immediately after the first treatment. That's my view. Thank you.
Wonderful. You know, and I also, Charles, I want to come to you in just a second, but I have to say I've made notes over the last couple of days. Every time I heard ML or data mentioned in sessions or in the hallway, and just in other sessions that I've attended, I've heard people talking about use of unsupervised learning to predict ablative success across variable SDRs. I've heard people talking about kind of a FUS adjacent area, improved results from liquid biopsy, ML for Parkinson's or other indication patient selection. And just last night I was talking to somebody who asked, could we predict patient movement during treatment using machine learning? So I think these are other things that are starting to bubble up as hypotheses where it could be applied. So Charles, I didn't mean to cut you off, please.
Not at all. Well, so I've been dabbling in the space of essential tremor treatment, and I thought a little bit, I tried to schematize where machine learning could come into play, and I'm informed also by what's happening in the multiple sclerosis world. So I would divide perhaps applications in the planning phase and in the prognostic post-operative monitoring phase. In the planning phase, and we heard that during the conference, Rick just mentioned it, simulating in a rapid way, understanding the pressure, simulating the pressure field. Today, the skull density ratio is used as a predictor of that, but there might be other information in the image that machine learning could make use of. And this is tightly, as I understand it, tightly linked to accelerating that process of predicting, accurately predicting the pressure field. Another aspect during the planning phase is target definition. Now, target definition, I can imagine machine learning approaches or even deep learning approaches being applied to target definition with respect to anatomy. So if you want to define the pressure field that will be optimal to target a certain part of the thalamus and avoid other parts associated with presumably associated with side effects. That's one aspect, and the other is to directly try and find the relationship between images, pressure fields, and outcome and clinical outcome. One area that I think is becoming quite successful is simply, it's generating synthetic image contrasts. Why is that interesting? For instance, in looking at thalamic anatomy, when you are trying to define a target within the thalamus, there might be some contrasts that are not routinely acquired. For instance, white matter null images of the thalamus, or maybe some dual inversion recovery or DTI measurements, and they're not acquired sometimes for lack of time. And so being able to derive synthetic contrasts might help in directly visualizing targets better, and also in being better substrates for segmentation algorithms that in turn also can be based on artificial intelligence approaches. For instance, an example is Thomas. Perhaps some of you are familiar with it. Dr. Saranathan has developed this family of approaches to parcellate the thalamus. More complex in the planning phase will be perhaps one day dynamically adapting the pressure field to altered anatomy. As you do multiple sonications, anatomy changes, whether it's a skull anatomy, whether it's the brain anatomy, and how can you quickly adapt your pressure field. Finally, in the prognostic postoperative monitoring, I can give you one example that might benefit from machine learning on large data sets, is understanding when tremor recurrence will occur, and perhaps also other side effects. And I'll end there. I just hope that I can stimulate a little bit of conversation with this.
Great, so this seeds our conversation with some possible use cases. Let's shift the lens slightly and talk about kind of the ML first perspective. Now, I've been kind of fast and loose with my terms, and I usually get upset with people that do that, but I've talked about AI, which is a really amorphous term. ML, of course, is really non-deterministic systems that learn from the data. What are we talking about in terms of ML tooling that we as a research community, as manufacturers, as clinicians need to be aware of? Are we talking about primarily supervised learning with artificial neural networks, or what do we want to put on the table as having potentially the greatest value? Tianji, you want to take that?
Yeah, sorry. So yeah, I think just the deep neural networks framework, which is of course just big name nowadays, and we can use this more recent, or more in some sense just a more innovative framework to solve many of the problems, especially in the field of just the ultrasound situation. I think just say those tools can be potentially very useful if we want to analyze, for example, ultrasound imaging data. Especially if we have large amount of observations with a lot of labels, those can be good. But meanwhile, I don't think that is really the only direction we want to that could be pretty helpful to pursue. So from a high level perspective, of course, the machine learning field has been defined, has been there, very helpful there, just maybe even 30 years before before we have deep learning. So at a high level perspective, say if we look at some of the current modern say machine learning computations, so in some of the say Kaggle challenges, Kaggle computations, in many of the type of problems, actually deep learning is usually not the winner for the best performance. So I think just generally speaking, we want to just be pretty open to different type of machine learning techniques. Deep learning, deep neural networks would definitely be a very good, very important category, but there could be other situations. And for the medical related problems, especially just in the situation of, for example, clinical trials, where we only have potentially for very important new treatment, medical treatment, potentially you could only have relatively small sample, small size of sample. And so just because we usually only have a few hundreds or maybe even fewer than that patients in the observation, where we actually could measure a lot of different, say, immunization, cell components, proportions, or gene expressions. In many of these type of studies, in previous literature, people realize that, say, even if you build some very complicated neural networks, the predictive performance may not be much better, or maybe it's even similar to many much simpler, more classical methods where you actually carefully just work on the data. And meanwhile, the simpler method, the advantage for them could be the interpretation, because sometimes we do not really care about the quantitative accuracy or just some performance metric that much. Sometimes we try to get some clear picture about potential follow-up study, potential interpretation of the medical mechanism, and just so using simpler method tend to give you much better interpretation from that perspective. So that could be observed in many previous literatures, and also in our specific experience, we also just try to work on some clinical trial data where we have a lot of just cell measurements, just maybe hundreds of them, but only maybe 20 observations. In these situations, actually, it turns out that using some very basic techniques could give you much more interpretable result with similar performance compared to just more complicated methods. So I think just at the end, what could be a focus really depends on the nature of the problem. Deep learning could be a good option, but there should be other problems that's worth investigating using other machine learning techniques.
Great, well, thank you. And let's move on to the second major theme. And I realize we're running about 8 minutes behind where I wanted to be at this point. So Matt, you've had an awfully easy time so far, so I'm going to direct something your way. So the second theme is the biggest challenges to overcome in applying ML to drive meaningful results. And there's a lot of ambiguity around how to safely develop ML-based software and medical devices. How do we navigate this topic of regulation? And does this impact the use cases that we want to tackle?
Yeah, it's a really interesting space. So a few observations on this. I think in general, as an industry, we have actually been regulating software-based devices for years, and we do know how to do it. And I think sometimes we lose sight of the fact that this is software, and we're using models and algorithms in combination with other technology to do things. So actually, a lot of the medical device regulations, or MDRs, are catching up. And if you look at sort of the recent EU MDR, the UK MHRA, they've now got increasingly useful guidance on how to develop and maintain and govern these sort of technologies. So I think in many ways, the information's out there. The key is going to the right place, because if you sort of look for it in a broad sense, there will always be many, many organizations giving you advice and guidance and various other things. But actually, the source of truth for the actual sort of regulatory framework typically will sit with the medical device regulator. And that's a very good place to start, because it's prescriptive. And the other thing I would say there is, that's not a bad thing. It's useful being told how to do things. It's helpful being told how to do things safely. And I'd always sort of encourage people to embrace the regulatory side of it, rather than sort of what you sometimes see, which is people sort of duck it a little bit, dare I say. So I think the key there is get to the right source of information, start with the MDR, and that will be really helpful and provide you with a lot of good guidance. Now, that doesn't mean it's easy, and clearly there's a trade-off in all this. To your point about where you start, I think that's a really interesting one. A couple of general observations on use cases, and not to be contrary, but just to provide a perspective. So far the use cases discussed are very likely very high impact, fairly complex, and very specific to the area. What I encounter a lot in healthcare is wrapped around these use cases are typically other areas where there's enormous benefit in automation and productivity. And so something to think about as you consider use cases is, in addition to these sort of use cases talked about so far, which are highly domain specific, is there opportunity just to automate around these areas? How much administration could be automated? How much productivity could be gained by actually just streamlining some processes? And in healthcare, there's often loads. And so, to be candid, often some really boring use cases are really good places to start, because they can be really high volume. People will thank you for automating them. And actually the complexity of the model, to the conversation we just had, may be significantly lower, because you're trying to do something frankly easier. So just something to seed in there. And then last observation is to the point about where to start. Absolutely, if you can start, and we do this quite a lot with customers, start with something that has a research or is research application. So you're not using it in anger. So you're not jumping straight away to clinical decision support. You're not immediately, trying a model on a patient. What you're doing is you're developing know-how. You're developing the expertise and the technology in a research context, and you can demonstrate its value in a research context. And then you can start to see how the research you develop or the models you develop in research can be applied in a clinical context. And I think that's just honest. It's tough to jump straight into clinical use cases. If you can build things out in research, test them in research, demonstrate their applicability in research, and then extend them into clinical frontline, that's a good, in my view at least, that can be a good way to go. Now that doesn't mean we shouldn't dive straight in with some areas of clear unmet need. To your point, Rick, about, let's really focus on where, the outcome is important. But there are different ways in. And I think sometimes as an industry, and we can be a little guilty of trying to do the most difficult thing first. And it may well be that's not the place to start. You might want to start with something a little lower hanging fruit, dare I say, and build the capability and then start to move it into a clinical frontline use case.
Great, thank you, Matt. Although you had some wonderful insights, although I think we had a little bit of an audio issue because I thought I heard you say something about embracing the regulatory side of this. So I'll get back to you on that one.
Tell us how to do things, but never knock it.
So just in 1 to 2 minutes tops, I wanted to hit on data collection and reporting. Charles, Allison, did you have anything you want to say about this? Because we have such diverse and often small data sets. What would you say?
I would like to, Rick, if I may, I would like to first to give a friendly rebuttal to Matt. I think that the clinical data sets of approved use cases like essential tremor give us actually a unique opportunity today. And I agree with what Matt was saying, but the perspective is that jumping into clinical applications, which arguably will be the most impactful at the end, in, let's say, phase 4, post-approval, where you are starting to accumulating a lot of data, it doesn't mean that you immediately are going to apply it in a non-supervised way to the clinical application, but starting the research there could be very useful. And I was smiling when Matt was talking about the simple problems, solving boring problems, but that are very, very useful. Fully agree with that perspective. But I just wanted to say that in terms of the data collection, again, I think there's an opportunity. I think that as we move forward, we won't very rapidly get to a clinical application that is fully, regulated and productized. It will take time. But I think that there's a case to be made to working collaboratively and transparently. And as a lot of centers are in the clinically approved cases, acquiring data, pooling that data, standardizing what data to pool, whether it's the pressure fields that were used, the images that were used for planning, the clinical outcomes, etc., will come in very useful and also will give a playing field for the true AI scientists to try out new things. So that's why I think that it would be very fruitful to actually look at the clinical applications, even if we don't expect immediate regulated and approved solutions. Perhaps I might have forgotten something. I'm slightly jet lagged. I'm back in Europe now, and I arrived this morning without much sleep, so I apologize if I'm rambling and I'm not realizing it. Rick, was there something else that you asked me to address?
No, that is fine. And for those of you waiting by the microphones, we'll be getting to questions in just about 5 minutes. Allison, is there anything else you'd like to add to this topic of standardized data collection and reporting?
Yeah, I think,
data sets?
Yeah, just to revisit Matt's comments about regulatory, I mean, I've had pre-submission meetings with regulatory agencies where they tell you exactly what they're going to want to see in your submission, and they, what what histological data they want reported, or what you're going to have to prove. So that tells you, the endpoint and gives you an indication of this is the kind of data you're going to need for the analysis, and that's actually driven a lot of our work in my lab. But throughout the conference, people have talked about needing multi-site trials. We need more data. Dr. Woodworth was talking about liquid biopsy and making sure they were at specific regular time points, and just making sure when we do try to standardize or combine these data sets, it's going to be a lot easier for us if we are able to come up with specific protocols or things that we're all trying to follow to some degree with some regularity, and that will just give us stronger data sets to analyze and answer some interesting questions with.
Okay, excellent, thank you. And moving on to the third theme, I naturally look to Matt here, but others can weigh in as well. What can we learn from other healthcare machine learning successes and or failures? What are some valuable lessons?
A couple of quick thoughts. And again, forgive me because I come sort of the production world of this, so the really trying to get these things into operational use. I think in addition to the research and the modeling pieces, really think about the clinical workflow and how these technologies fit. Quite often we come across situations where, the model is great, but we really struggle to work out how it's actually going to fit into a clinical workflow. People are super busy. The actual productization or getting these things into production can be quite challenging. And so thinking through, where does this fit? How will it be used? How will the technology be provisioned? And I don't think you want to do that day one, because to Charles's point, you don't want to stifle innovation. But I do think quite quickly, once you start to see the model developing, what this conversation shows you is wrapped around it is, I'm afraid, an awful lot of complexity when you want to use it in clinical frontline. And so working out how it fits in, how you're going to govern it, how you're going to control model drift, that's a big concern, right? Which is, the populations change. How do you evolve your models so that they remain current? So I think, my overarching thought would be absolutely multidisciplinary, great opportunities to build models to address new challenges, but just think about how they fit in day-to-day clinical practice. So you can actually see how these things, in the end, will get used to generate the outcomes you want.
Great, thank you. So moving to our fourth theme, advice or guidance for those seeking to apply ML and focused ultrasound therapies. How can those in the ecosystem without deep ML backgrounds help prepare for this future that we're talking about today? Allison, I don't know if you want to weigh in, or Tianji, or others.
Sure. We have let our students lead. They're the ones that came up with the questions and wanted to investigate it. And quite frankly, many of us were very skeptical about it. And it was a good skepticism, because it made you think about, is machine learning a really good option for analyzing this data set? Is it going to add something, or do we need to spend more time with the physics, or does it need to be more of a physics integrated approach? And so that's where we found the motivation in our group. But by doing that, we were able to find some interesting questions to ask. Very good.
Bing or Tianji, either one of you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I want to second Alice's point. Actually, I think it would be great to involve more students for this type of problems. They are just, because, they kind of, I think it's sometimes actually good to maybe hold some type of student computation for a certain task, just, giving people just more opportunities to freely explore different solutions for specific problems. And sometimes the result could be good, and just more importantly, we might be able to learn some very good lessons by just, by looking at people's summations for this type of computation. I think that could also be very helpful for exploring some future directions.
Excellent. Any other thoughts, Bing?
Yep. So for the sake of time, I'll just keep my answer short. So if you do not have, if you are in the fast environment and you do not have those deep learning background knowledge, just talk to those people, find those people who do have this type of background.
Excellent.
Yeah, that's just my view.
Thank you. And as we move to audience questions, I want to just spend 30 seconds to let you know, and I'm hoping I don't regret this, but my email address is rhamilton@fussfoundation.org. Again, rhamilton@fussfoundation.org. Over the weeks and months ahead, you're going to hear news about the fact that the foundation is going to try to help you by aggregating use cases, by cataloging successes and work that's going on, and providing resources to you to help you advance these efforts. If you have ideas, experiments, thoughts, and you want to reach out, please do so. I want to hear from you. Now, I'm not going to give you my home phone number, but we'll cross that bridge if we need to. You've been waiting patiently now for about 15 minutes, so what question did you have?
Awesome. So this is actually a two-part question. I work in the blood-brain barrier opening research realm, and I think it's very interesting that you mentioned instead of using a contrast agent, you could potentially gather the acoustic data and determine when the blood-brain barrier opened that way. I was hoping that you could elaborate a little bit more on that. And then I think my second question would be, do you think it's possible to estimate when the blood-brain barrier would close based off that data too?
I guess that question is for me. So, okay. So to be honest, we're still in the early exploration phase. So we started asking this question when I started this lab last year. And so to answer your first question, so basically we just collected all the acoustic emission data from the stimulated microbubbles during the treatment, and we do not use the general stable or inertial cavitation calculation. We just convert the time domain acoustic data into the frequency domain, and we do not specifically select specific bandwidths, for example, the subharmonics or the harmonics, and we just get that data and do a type of feature selection, and then use a random forest or other feature extraction models to fit into our prediction model. Currently, we're using SVDD model, but we're also trying to use the autoencoder or other type of models to do this type of prediction. So currently, for the hemorrhage or for the damage prediction, we can get a pretty good result. Probably accuracy we can get bigger than 80%, but for the reopening, right now we can only get around 60% prediction accuracy. So we still have a lot of work need to do to improve that. And for your second question, for the closure, so we haven't. That's a good question. That's a great question, but we haven't thought about that yet. So yeah. So in the future, we might be able, we might take that into consideration as well. Thank you. Thank you for the question.
Thank you for the question, and thank you, Bing. And we have about 1 minute left. Quickly, please.
Hello. Fortunately, my question is an extension of the previous question about the use case with blood-brain barrier opening. Specifically, what do you think machine learning can offer over conventional signal processing in this application, given that there is such a direct link between the signals and outcomes that can be analyzed with frequency analysis, and that there's so much variation from system to system?
Right. Okay, all right. So I can think of two potential benefits of machine learning over the conventional methods. So the first one is for the stable cavitation or inertial cavitation, like people use the intensity, right? Or the area under the curve of a certain frequency band in the frequency spectrum, which we could say is a one-dimensional feature. With machine learning, it can extract the multi-dimensional features, so which potentially can lead to a more accurate prediction. And the second is currently, as you said, different groups, they have all different algorithms for calculating stable inertial cavitation dose. For example, some people, they calculate the AUC within the ultraharmonic band, or some people, they're using subharmonic. And so currently, there isn't a universal standard for this. So with machine learning, we hope we are able to find a somewhat universal model that can be readily used across different groups and across different devices, because we just fit into all the acoustic emission data into that model, and that model tells us whether it is open or not.
Excellent.
Hope I answered the question. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you for the question. Thank you to all the panelists, and thank you for your interest in this topic. Again, please reach out. Let me know your ideas, your thoughts, and I look forward to continuing this dialogue in the months to come. So thank you.